What we're going to now do is move into the second session, which is on the topic of the global university and internationalism. And we're extremely fortunate to have a world authority on that subject, Professor of Sociology and Southeast Asia Studies, and the Chair of the Department of Sociology, Professor Raka to introduce us.
Good morning and welcome, Chancellor Dirks, distinguished panelists, who will, I assume, soon be here, and good morning, Berkeley. What an opportunity we have today to get to think about three issues that are core to Berkeley's continuing excellence, and to be able to do so in conversation with people who have spent a lifetime thinking about them. The topic for this panel is the role of the global university. Our main speakers today are Lee Bollinger, Professor of Law and President of Columbia University, under whose charge Columbia has developed a very particular model of global engagement, about which I will say more below. And George Breslauer, Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost of this university, who will address the breadth of Berkeley's global engagement. They'll be followed by Nezar AlSayyad, who has been for many years chair of the Center for Middle East Studies and who therefore knows firsthand what global engagement involves. Professor AlSayyad will respond to the speakers and will host the Q&A. Now, I've been at Berkeley for 20 years. And for about half that time, I was the chair of the Center for South Asia Studies. My own research involves countries outside the US. So does the research of many of my colleagues and many of our students. Undoubtedly, Berkeley is a leader in producing global scholars and global scholarship. But what is a global university? And indeed, what do we want a global university for? I'd like to use my opening comments to reflect on that question. What do we want a global university for? There could be many reasons we want a global university. If we look at the models of attempts at global universities, we do get a sense of some of the reasons. So I'm going to list some models below, but please remember that I'm a sociologist and we deal in ideal types, so that I don't assume that these models are pure or that any one institution follows only one model. Okay, so the first model is the campus abroad model. This is a model that Yale and NYU have followed, the setting up of satellite campuses abroad. This was meant to be revenue generating, but has not apparently always proven to be so. The second model is the executive courses model, which brings bureaucrats and other professionals from other countries, from countries around the world, into the university for sort of specialized executive courses over the summer. Harvard, among others, has this model. Professionals from other countries get the prestige of a Harvard certificate, and at least in India, they try to pass it off as a Harvard degree. And Harvard gets the revenue. The third model is the Outpost Model, the establishment of offices abroad, regional hubs providing offices for faculty as well as study and internship opportunities for students. This is the Columbia model. This model is one that enables increased contact to happen and makes it clear that Columbia is open for conversations and collaborations in that particular country. And we'll hear more from President Bollinger about that model. Does Berkeley have a model? I believe it does. And I would call it the public engagement model. Berkeley has historically had more Peace Corps volunteers than any other university. Our students participate in internships with nonprofits all over the world. We partner with scientists and other scholars around the globe to produce ideas that matter. And we have a unique engagement with online classes. MOOCs, or massively open online classes, are much in the news. They are controversial for good reason and have led to an enormously generative debate on the meaning of teaching. Yet the Berkeley variant is again different. We don't have for-profit MOOCs, but we have specifically not-for-profit MOOCs that our faculty create precisely to enable students in far-flung places to have access to materials created by Berkeley professors, which they would not otherwise normally have, and that they could not afford to buy. This, then, is the model I have termed the public engagement model, and it's one that fits our mission as a great public university. If this is a model that Berkeley can work with, how do we deepen it? How do we ensure that we keep the core values of public education front and central to our deepening global engagement? And how do we prevent our global public engagement from becoming a colonial enterprise? By colonial enterprise, I mean one which is primarily undertaken for financial profit, or which goes into another country thinking that we have the solutions and they have the problems. A truly global engagement, and one which has the potential to create real knowledge and deep cultural understanding, is one that moves away from this missionary or developmentalist model. It's only when we approach such an enterprise with humility that we are likely to create successfully a relationship in which one is not resentful of another. We live in an unequal world, and sustainable global engagement cannot happen without a deep appreciation of that fact. To return then to the question with which I began, as I turn the floor over to President Bollinger, I hope that the panelists address the models of global engagement, that before they address the models of global engagement they know best, that they will stop to ask, what do we want a global university for? I believe that the answers to this question will shape the nature of our engagement. I know there are financial reasons that many of these models are being put in place, but I'd like to think that as we take this discussion forward, we won't pick a model or run with a model that is counter to our core intellectual objectives. And to conclude, I offer one reason that I believe we should have a global university. And ironically, I'm going to call upon that great bard of colonialism, Rudyard Kipling, to help me make my point. Rudyard Kipling famously asked, "What should they know of England, who only England know?" Thus, one motivation we might have to encourage our students to study other languages, to go abroad, to have meaningful interactions with students and scholars from other cultures, to do research on issues important to other people, is that we understand ourselves better as we seek to understand others. We come to understand ourselves in relation to those others, and this, I think, leads to a profound transformation of the possibilities of knowledge. In some sense, the motivation to have a global university in the 21st century, and I was reflecting on this as I was listening to the earlier panel on undergraduate and liberal education, I think it's similar to the motivation for liberal arts education in the 19th and 20th centuries. It makes you a better citizen of the world, a citizen who is connected, who is as willing to learn as to teach, and perhaps, as Michael Roth reminded us, willing to have one's soul set aflame. And with that, I'd like to turn to President Bollinger of Columbia University to tell us how he imagines the global university as well as its role.
So it's a pleasure, a real pleasure to be here, and I'll say more at the ceremony about Nick and just how deep a friend he is of all of us at Columbia, how much we respect him, how other people do as well, but it's just fantastic that he's taking on this role. We've also spent, that is Nick and I and other people here, Safwan Masri, who's in the front row, and Carol Becker and others from Columbia. We've spent a long time over the past decade talking about this question, what is a global university? What does it mean to a university that the world is changing? So let me offer some kind of summary of what I and I think we have thought about that. I agree completely with what was just said, that you really have to start with the premise of what is it that you want a university to be, and that's, of course, a profound and very complicated question. You also have to think about what relationship you want a university to have to the outside world, and that's also complicated because we really want to be thinking about important issues, and we want to be thinking deeply and reflectively about things that really matter to human beings all over the planet. So we want to know what's happening. On the other hand, we really don't want to become so engrossed with what's happening at the moment that we can't do what we do best, which is to step back, think about things deeply, take 5 years to write a book or a decade to write a book about something, because we're the only institution that can do that. So we don't want to be too engaged. On the other hand, we don't want to be too distant because we end up then running the risk that everything we have to say will be pointless. So you really have to know something about your purposes, and you have to have some idea about how you stand in relation to the world. So as I've reflected on this myself over the past decade or so, my own view is that the world has changed and is changing radically. And the universities, that all of us in universities have to adjust to this new reality. I mean, that's a bigger way to put it than in fact may be the case, but for purposes of emphasis, I think it will do. So what are the things that are happening that are transforming the reality, the world we live in? I think there are two major ones. I think the first is the rise of a global economy and the opening of markets all over the world, and not strictly democratic kinds of societies that are opening markets, but there are absolute commitments to some kind of capitalist economy that are occurring in places that were formerly closed. And that means increasingly we are interconnected through the system of foreign direct investment, through capital flows, through trade in goods and services. And that's not a trivial matter. So, as someone said recently to me, and I think it's a powerful way to put it, Ben Bernanke can talk about tapering, and immediately a poor person in India has to pay more for a refrigerator. I mean, this is the kind of world we have. 50% of the debt of the United States is owned by countries and peoples outside of the United States. 50% of all the goods we consume in the developed world are made in the developing world. There's just so many statistics, so many facts that you can point to that the new global economy makes us deeply interconnected, deeply integrated. You just can't ignore that. I think the second major change and an extremely powerful force is the invention of the first technologies in human history that are truly global in nature. And of course, I'm thinking about the internet and computers, but also satellites and the capacity to have global television, global channels. These two things are just immensely important. As somebody who has spent my adult life in universities thinking about freedom of speech and press from a primarily First Amendment U.S. constitutional standpoint, I am very keenly aware that every time a new communications technology is introduced, there are massive changes in the society that occur. And I have written, and I believe that the great developments of freedom of speech and press in the United States, which we now take as a given, what really only were created in the 1960s with cases like New York Times versus Sullivan, and others were a direct result of the creation of a national economy from a primarily local and state economy, and by the introduction of national communications technologies. And I'm thinking of radio and television. And those two forces led to a world in which we had to say, we can no longer have freedom of speech and press standards that are local. We have to interpret the First Amendment to create national standards. And that's what New York Times versus Sullivan did with respect to defamation laws and libel. So my view is that what happened just in my own area in the 1960s in a nationalizing of standards and institutions now has to take place on a global basis, and we're just at the beginning of this. The two changes that I just referred to as overwhelmingly powerful, that is a global capitalist economy and a new set of communications technologies that are global, these are recent. So these are 10, 15, maybe 20 years old, and therefore we are just at the beginning, but we can already see these incredible changes before us. So then you say there are now huge global issues, and by global issues I mean those things that are problems or potential for the world that can only be addressed on a global basis. It's no longer within the power of one country, even one as powerful as the United States, to solve them. So we know about climate change, but there are so many others. A great fact about the global economy is that it benefits some people enormously. And it benefits people at the top who are becoming wealthier. And it benefits people, many millions of people, at the very low end of the socioeconomic spectrum. But there are huge swaths of population of people who are not advantaged by globalization, who are actually hurt by it. And we know about workers who could have a job making things, but other peoples around the world would be prepared to make that for a lot less, and therefore these people lost their jobs here. But it's much more beyond, it goes way beyond that. So we didn't expect, I think, the capacities of the kind of knowledge and sort of businesses and like automobiles. We didn't think that the rest of the world could master these kinds of processes, productions, as quickly as they have. And as a consequence, there's a great dislocation that is occurring among very large numbers of people. And that's a problem that is global in character and has to be figured out. And it's not subject to easy solutions like just retrain people. I mean, this is a very, very big problem. In my own area, again, I see this because, just as I said, I think in my lifetime we went from a kind of a disparate, state-oriented freedom of speech and press system to a national one. And the casebook I still teach out of on First Amendment really only talks about the U.S. Issues of freedom of speech and press, and yet we know that when you say something now, you are saying it globally. And that means you can be sued for libel in another country, as happens, and they can enter a judgment against you, and they can bring it to enforce it. And if it's not enforced here, you still are affected because you can't travel to those countries, because if you do, you will be held accountable for that judgment. There are criminal actions against people for speech that has occurred or arisen out of the United States and other places. There are civil actions. But beyond that, I mean, we have an enormous need, not just to control censorship, but to learn about the world through journalistic enterprises. And we see other countries rising up to this reality with new state-sponsored media like CCTV, like Al Jazeera, France 24, Russia Today. My view is we should have an American World Service that is like the BBC World Service, but that really tries to address questions around the globe on a sort of on an objective, independent, journalistic basis. Point I'm making is that there are major forces at work here. We're at the beginning of them, and there are global issues of enormous scope. And it requires every one of us in the university world, I think, to step back and ask, are our fields as we've known them, are our subjects as we've developed them, in need of change? because of this new reality. That happened after World War II with the creation of regional institutes, languages, of our efforts to try to come to terms with a new world of the Cold War and nuclear capacities. I think we're in that kind of era again. So I could go on and sort of on that theme. The question is, if you start to think that way, that the world changed, we have to adjust, how do you do that as a university? Well, as was pointed out, there are many strategies, and every university is thinking about these. And my view is that if you start from the premise I just did, I think you probably don't want you don't want a branch campus model. Branch campus model is, I'm going to give the best argument for it in a second, but I think the branch campus model has a real problem of quality control. That's a kind of obvious point. It raises questions about, you're there and you're committed. You're probably only going to go to places that are really very wealthy, because it's actually very expensive to do what we do. I always like to say, I mean, we are in universities extremely good at losing money. I mean, we do not know how to monetize things, and we do not know how to make profits, but we really know how to think about the public good and how to lose money at it. And that's a specialty that we have. And if that reality means that you're not going to go to Nairobi and set up a branch campus. You're probably going to go to someplace in the Emirates and someplace else. And I think that's a problem with how we think about the new reality and globalization and universities. I think the greatest problem is that it doesn't affect the home campus. Again, if you start from the idea that we all have to think about our fields, we have to know not just about China. It's not just that we need experts on China, we do, and we need more of them. But we also, all of us need to know more about China. I mean, I feel it's sort of embarrassing how little very educated people, and I include myself in this, know about parts of the world. I mean, it's really quite, it's not right for this world. But we need higher general knowledge, but we also need to have people who, and all of us know not just about China, but about China's relation to India and India's relation to South America. It's a system, a global network. And I don't think a branch campus does that for you. I think the best argument for the branch campus is that you're going to get very, very talented people from all over the world who might not otherwise come, and you can bring them into your total university and complete university and take the benefit of that. I think that's great. And I think the strongest argument that's usually not made, it's a little embarrassing to make publicly, but I can make it because I don't do branch campuses, is that if you really wanted to change the world and make it more open, more responsive to human needs, maybe democratic, less authoritarian, one way to do it is to plan a liberal arts education right in the middle of an authoritarian regime. It's not a bad strategy. But those who do it aren't going to say that that's why they're doing it, because that's a dangerous thing to do when you're taking a lot of money to set up your campus. So I don't think it actually addresses the underlying the problem. So what we've done is to say we need to be out in the world. It's probably a time actually for more empirical kind of work, for learning more about the world as it is, because it's on that basis that you can then ask questions that are meaningful, that are bigger, that are deeper, that require more reflection. So we need to be out there probably working on things. In any event, we need new opportunities to engage with the world. And so we have these 8 centers, and they're offices with some facilities, and they vary in their amount, very flexible. We can leave them in a week if we need to. Very sophisticated people who lead them, former ministers of mines and agriculture and so on. And these are now forming not just a place in Istanbul or Nairobi or Mumbai or Santiago or Rio. They are together as a group trying to help us understand the world. So then we, just as a model, ask yourself this question. We're not doing this year, but we started out with a little idea There are lots of schools that are obviously doing this. School of Public Health are notorious for their great work around the world. And SIPA, the School of International Public Affairs, clearly engaged with the world. We have great regional institutes. So all this is to build on this international institution we have. But we said, let's offer students the opportunity to stay for a 5th year at Columbia. And in that 5th year, we'll accept their tuition dollars, but we will give them a month or 2 months of introduction to globalization from an economics perspective, from a legal, from a sociological, from a cultural, from an artistic. And this is what the world is like. This is where energy comes from. These are the issues. This is the geographic basis of problems. Okay, and then they will take the next 6 months and travel to each of the global centers and do research on a major global topic, and then return and write it up and talk about this in a group. Well, I mean, when I say this to any group, including myself, I want to go on that trip. I mean, I want to go on that year, and that's the power, I think, of this. So we're beginning to help faculty and students to try to learn more about the world by utilizing these networks.
Well, my role is to say something about what Berkeley has been doing and has been talking about in recent years. And really, a lot of what has happened at Berkeley has been, I would call, intensification of a level of internationalization that was already quite high in many respects. And then I want to say a few words about the nature of discussions about sort of where we go from here. I think Berkeley's commitment to international studies in many different forms has been long-standing, and that's perhaps measured by one indicator, and that is that more than 50% of our total faculty either study foreign areas or collaborate in their research with scholars located abroad. That's a pretty impressive statistic to me as an indicator of the level of internationalization of one's focus, one's attention, one's strategies, what you do with that knowledge, how you transmit it to various audiences, both local and global, is a separate matter. But I think that our recent intensification has been driven by several senses that have been alluded to or mentioned. One is the recognition that Americans historically have been very parochial people, and you don't really know what it is about your culture that you're taking for granted as right and natural until you understand what the assumptions are that are embedded in other cultures. So you can't understand yourself except in relation to others, and Professor Ray had mentioned that by way of Kipling. We also realize, and this is not an eternal truth, this is a more contemporary truth, and that is that most of our graduates, whatever professions they choose to go into, are going to be operating in a world in which they will have to interrelate with, perhaps work very closely with, people who are not located in the United States or of the United States. So that's sometimes reduced to the phrase, we have to train global citizens. Thirdly, I think, is the combined altruistic and self-interested motivation, and that is realizing that global problems are truly global, that the United States can no longer assume that it's got fish to the west and fish to the east, a friend to the north and a friend to the south, so what do you have to worry about? Realizing that this process of globalization that President Bollinger has described is both inexorable and forces us to treat the global as local, means that our research has to be into global problems and modes of cooperating globally in order to solve those problems. Climate change was mentioned. I would also mention disease control. Yeah. That's going to come home to haunt us. And when you think of how air travel has affected the ability to transmit disease globally, increasingly so over time. That's another example. And of course, there has been an instrumental reason for a form of intensification of internationalization, and that is the diversification of one's revenue sources. There are concentrations of wealth abroad, unlike anything we had imagined even 25 years ago, that are now being tapped into for instrumental revenue-generating reasons. Now, what's been happening here at Berkeley? Well, annually we have about 3,000 visiting scholars and postdoctoral fellows from abroad, and this is a 50% increase over what it was 10 years ago. In the past 6 years, we've tripled the number of international students in our undergraduate student body, and more than doubled the number of international students who attend our summer sessions. We've tasked the Dean of Education Abroad to triple the number of Berkeley matriculated students who spend a summer, a semester, or a year abroad, either doing coursework or internship, not tourism. That doesn't count toward that number. We teach about 60 foreign languages and have invested heavily in sustaining the availability of low enrollment languages and in ensuring that those who want to take foreign languages, whether high enrollment or low enrollment, will not be blocked out for lack of seats. It's an example of a virtuous reason for losing money. We've established a global engagement office to facilitate maintenance and expansion of contacts and relationships with institutions abroad. Thinking of it conceptually, this reduces the search and transactions costs for our students, staff, and faculty who are seeking to build relationships between themselves and colleagues abroad or between UC Berkeley and institutions abroad. Spurred by our new Chancellor, we have begun discussion of emulation of the Columbia model regarding the opening of offices abroad, which, from my standpoint, is a very exciting prospect. And the way you framed the way in which one could use those as a network that enhanced the educational experience intensively for your students is something I was not aware of. I knew about the offices abroad, thought of them in terms of enhancing relationships, hadn't thought of them in terms of this intense educational experience, but I think that's magnificent. We've recently proliferated organizational partnerships, largely led by our deans. Some of them research, some of them teaching-oriented, most of them research. Organizational partnerships between units at Berkeley, whether the College of Letters and Science or the College of Engineering or others, with universities and research institutions abroad, so far especially in France, China, Singapore, Norway, the Philippines, and Taiwan. Many of our professional schools have launched training programs for delegations from abroad that are, I think in the last 2 years, the Goldman School of Public Policy has gone from 2 such countries to 8 to 10 such countries. This has been gratifying to observe because it's an example of something that does not have to come from the top, that the initiative from the deans can actually make this happen, and we can piggyback on it and use it as test beds for what works and what doesn't work. We are experimenting vigorously in the online education realm, whether it's to improve the pedagogy at Berkeley, to enhance the availability of subject matter for our own students, to generate revenue, or to allow globalization of the knowledge that we are imparting here through MOOCs. And so we have teamed up with edX and are involved in the MOOC enterprise, but it is only one portion of our online effort. And we're dealing with this gingerly because we realize that A, it can be a costly failure, and B, it can be an embarrassment if done poorly, and C, there's not necessarily a first mover advantage in this realm, so we don't have to charge to the front. We're developing our Richmond Bay campus, and that's just at the conceptual stage at the moment, but spurred by a comment and a proposal made by our late Dean of Engineering, Richard Newton, we view that Richmond Bay campus as a potential source of insourcing of knowledge, where we bring the world to Richmond Bay and collaborate with scientists from abroad there and others, not just scientists, but humanists also from abroad, on collaborative projects that will allow us to benefit from the knowledge that is growing rapidly out there without necessarily having to go there all the time to do so. For reasons that President Bollinger mentioned regarding Columbia's choices, we're also skittish about campuses abroad. These entail large risks of failure, quality control being a big problem, faculty buy-in being a big problem, expense being a big problem, and again, in a realm in which there is certainly not necessarily a first mover advantage unless you're a wannabe, and Berkeley is not a wannabe. So I think the question then becomes for us, how do you align this intensification of global activities, engagements, and partnerships with a strategy for being, remaining, or becoming whatever one means by a global university? And I think it depends in good measure on your vision of where global higher education is headed. Are we headed in the direction of a convergence toward what Kenneth Pruitt has intriguingly referred to as a global ecosystem of higher educational institutions with standardization of procedures, norms, and quality standards, something like the global generalization of the Bologna and Erasmus projects in Europe? Or can that be done without a superordinate authority such as the European Union? Is it feasible among countries that have conflicting notions of academic freedom, intellectual property, employment law, antitrust law, and liberty? Questions to address. And if there is not such convergence, how do you regulate the balance between competition and cooperation among global universities? There's no easy answers, in my estimation. How much of such regulation, to the extent that it's possible, would require a coordinated effort by the leaders of global universities? And how much will be a product of what might be called spontaneous mutual adjustment between two actors? Now, the latter, spontaneous mutual adjustment, is currently the norm, such as the acceptance or not of joint faculty appointments with universities abroad. What implications would that have for intellectual property protection? That would be very interesting in the scientific technological areas. Ben Wildavsky has coined the phrase, the great brain race. Will the great brain race foster intensified competition among leading universities throughout the world? Is it feasible to moderate that competition? I mean, we used to worry about losing our faculty to the Ivy League and Stanford and Caltech, and now NYU and USC with all this money. But now we're talking not just about Oxford and Cambridge, we're talking about Chinese universities, we're talking about Singapore, we're talking about European universities that are now singular international competitors for our faculty. And if this competition goes unregulated, as my guess is it probably will this increase even further the already high cost of running high-quality teaching and research universities? Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Breslauer, and President Bollinger. It is indeed a pleasure to be here to celebrate the inauguration of Chancellor Dirks. My task today is to ask a few questions and to moderate questions from the audience. I am an urban historian, and my stock in trade is the study of cities and places. As a teacher for 25 years here at Berkeley, I have always operated from the fundamental belief that the study of other peoples, cultures, and nations is a necessary engagement and a knowledge that is for our own well-being and best interest, and not necessarily for theirs. This actually reminds me very much of something Michael Roth said earlier today in using the statement from Jane Addams, that education as a process should require us to see the world from someone else's vantage point. This is, of course, the generous view. But Berkeley, of course, like all other great universities, also plays a hegemonic role in this very specific global equation. I came to Berkeley in 1984 as a PhD student, and the institution actually kept me since that time. I actually came to study medieval urban history with a specific focus on late medieval and early modern Middle East. I needed to look at certain manuscripts that dealt with some of these cities and certain maps. Many of these were, in fact, in some libraries in places like Cairo, Damascus, Beirut, and Istanbul. But all of them were actually here at the Bancroft Library. None of them were any of these places alone. In a sense, I say that because I think it is very important for us to be aware of this particular heritage of a colonial past. Sure, that is exactly what it is, as well as the legacy of a rising superpower, the United States at the time, as it was collecting much of this. This was also, if you will, a different kind of global engagement than the one that we seek today. As we pay attention to the global, we cannot ignore this very specific history as we move into the future. So let me start by actually saying that some of us at Berkeley have always felt that Berkeley has been a global university by virtue of its student body, by virtue of its faculty expertise, and by simply virtue of its place in the academy. Yet others have expressed frustration that we have not really done enough and that we certainly need to do more. Our questions will likely deal with that. In fact, funny enough, I sat here for 45 minutes and I only got one question, and in the last 3 minutes, I got 15 questions. So my task was to try to arrange these, which is a very difficult task. Let me start, and this is actually a question that builds on quite a lot of the cards that I got, seeing them very quickly, and this is a question for President Bollinger. What is the global to you? How different is the global from the international? You spoke eloquently, and many of us have actually read about the achievements of Colombia with its global centers or, international consulates, something that you championed when as you are at Columbia and when Chancellor Dirks was also there. What has Colombia learned from this particular global experience? And in fact, what are its pitfalls, if any?
Well, I think, I'm not quite sure how best to address this. There is a way in which it's really very simple, and I'm always trying to make things as straightforward as possible. When I was a young law professor, I'm embarrassed to say that I thought the U.S. legal system was by far and away the best in the world. And if I were to travel to other countries to give a lecture, it was really to help them figure out how to be more like the United States legal system. Or at best, it was a kind of comparative experience. I find out how you treat things, and then I can bring that back and put it into an article I was doing on something in the American legal system. I think it's very important that we continue to do those things. I mean, the second, and not to think that the American legal system is by far the best, but it's certainly the second, the kind of comparative. I think it's extremely important that we continue to build a world that's peaceful, respectful of human rights. I mean, all these things I think of as the way we thought about the world from 1946 up until a decade or so. I'm using that just in a very rough sense. The problem today is, there are many ways to frame this, but the real problem today is that there are very serious matters, issues. And there's an enormous potential that's ahead for the world, but very serious issues that are global in dimension. And you look at the recent Great Recession. I sat on the Federal Reserve Bank, Federal Reserve Board for the Bank of New York, and until a year ago, January. So I sat through, for 6 years, the recession. And one of the powerful lessons of that was that we did not understand, the leading experts in the United States didn't understand many things, but didn't understand how this would be the way it was because of the global interconnectedness of the economy. They didn't see that if Lehman Brothers failed, that would have these profound effects in European banks and other banks around the world, which would radiate back and affect the automobile company. I mean, there are just many ways to say this. And we have a world that is organized around the way human beings, we all conceived of it after the Second World War and in the Cold War period. We have institutions that are designed for that world. And it's a world in which everybody has to cooperate for anything to happen. So you go to Basel to work on the global regulatory system, economic regulatory system. It's all, do you agree to do what we think? There's no leverage in that system other than a cooperative one. You think about problems, whatever they are, whether it's environmental issues globally or disease, and most players talk about this as a zero-sum game. The way we approach this is through countries thinking, what will we get out of this negotiation? So the world has these enormous issues by virtue of these changes. Our system for dealing with them is not adequate. This is where universities have to play and should play an enormously important role. So it's not just it's great to learn about the world and let's keep it safe and peaceful and so on. This is serious business. And universities, going back to my point about we don't monetize things, I mean, the people in the financial world are highly sophisticated about the world. We need, as universities, to play our role in critiquing that, reviewing it, understanding it, responding to it, not just in the economic sense, but in the cultural sense, the humanistic sense. We need to invent the institutions that will do this. And universities are one of the few institutions, great as we are, that have the capacity to approach these things from a public good standpoint. So I think this is true. I think it's true in journalism. You see the decline of journalism. Universities are more important than ever to this. And the global centers they're just places to help us do these things. There's nothing magic in them. They're just an infrastructure, like a library, to help us deal with these problems. So I think it's a very serious, practical kind of thing.
Excellent. Again, this is another question for President Bollinger. You've spoken about the benefits of globalization to researchers, to students, and with the engagement of other countries as well. and here I'm actually merging two questions together, should we not engage with countries which also have despots on their heads of government? Will that not impact the creation of a different kind of global citizen?
Right. Well, this is, of course, the essence of a very difficult problem. So we believe in academic freedom. We believe in non-discrimination in all kinds of forms. We're just committed to these as basic values. Many other countries are not committed to those values. So what do we make of this? Already we're very engaged with the world, as the Provost pointed out, and as you pointed out, and opening speaker pointed out. I mean, we have hundreds of agreements with other universities. Our faculty are very engaged in the world. We have schools that have offices around the world. I mean, we're hardly completely isolated from the rest of the world. So you got to start there. Second thing is you have to say, you could choose not to engage with countries that are authoritarian regimes. You could choose that. It's a hard problem. I personally think that there should be some involvement. I mean, what happens to China over the next several decades, obviously incredibly important for the world. Incredibly important for the world. It is extremely important for universities and all the ways we can talk about them to be part of that evolution. On the other hand, we don't want to become so much part of it that we compromise our values and we become complicit in breaches of things that we regard as fundamental. How do we draw that line? I don't pretend for a moment that that's a simple question. I do think that having open discussions on our campuses about that, serious, reflective discussions that don't just oversimplify, I think that is very important so that we have a kind of internal consensus about what we do. My view is the global centers approach we're comfortable with because it's a level of engagement or deepening our engagement we think is important for the future of the world. But it gives us the flexibility to withdraw if we feel compromised. I think the branch campus model, in all candor, poses greater risks for us in that way then.
This is actually the two questions to Executive Vice Chancellor Provost Breslauer. During your tenure as Executive Vice Chancellor Provost for almost a decade, international studies has had a difficult path here at Cal, with the separation of the teaching units from the research units, the elimination of international studies deanship, and disproportional budget cuts. Yet today, you seem to be charting a new course. What has changed? Have you had a change of heart? Have you had a change of boss? Or has the realities of global education, particularly in the past 4 or 5 years, changed that position?
This is Cal. This is a tough show. No, nothing really has changed, nor has my commitment to international studies changed. What has changed has been some organizational forms. But I think if you look beyond the organizational forms at the actual research and teaching and opportunities that have continued here under different organizational forms, you'll find that that is well characterized by intensification of international studies and international involvements. It's over this period, and I don't take any personal credit for this, but it's over this period that the opening of the Blum Center has vastly increased both the study of global poverty by our students and the opportunity to go abroad in order to alleviate global poverty in many parts of the globe. So if you get beyond the organizational forms, I think you'll find that the the curve has been upward in terms of the types of international studies and activities that we've been engaged in.
We're actually coming to the end of our session, so I'm going to just ask one more question, which I think is very important, and it's both to President Bollinger and Vice Chancellor Breslauer, and it has to do with the decline of Title VI, particularly, and as people in international area studies are expecting that less federal money is going to be available. Do you believe that other funds coming from elsewhere are likely to substitute for it, and what would that do to our way of global education?
I'll start on that one and pass it to you. Yeah. Okay. With Title VI being one of the victims of sequestration in Washington, we have been scurrying on several fronts here. I have put up funds in order to compensate for part of the cutbacks, but in addition, God bless them, the Mellon Foundation has stepped into that void to try to ensure that the teaching of foreign languages is not damaged by these cutbacks, and led by our Dean of Arts and Humanities, Tony Cascardi, as our ambassador to the Mellon Foundation in that regard and on that issue. We have been involved not only in acts of damage control, but also in planning for a future that will seek alternative sources of both funding and of delivery of foreign language instruction that would allow us to retain the high level of Title VI activity, even if not all the funds come from the Department of Education.
Well, it's a pity that we live in a time when it's very hard to make the case for successfully for very small amounts of money in a total budget of the United States to pay for more public goods like learning of languages, studies of other cultures and societies, or indeed serious journalism about the world, which I think of as a kind of soulmate of universities. So it's a pity, it's a reality, and I don't for a second think that universities should step back and say that that's we got to keep making the case. There's no question about that. On the other hand, or not on the other hand, in addition, we I think have to understand what we're about. We have to have plans for what we think we should do. And we have to raise money from private sources and foundations and nonprofits and others to support these activities. And I have found personally that this is actually quite simple to do. And there are many people in the world who feel that the things that we've talked about are extremely important. Our capacity for fundraising, I think, on an international basis is only beginning. All universities, including this one, including public universities, have built up over the past several decades quite sophisticated and very successful development operations. We're only at the beginning of doing that on an international basis. And I think there will be really large sums of support for this.
Well, I think we've reached the end of our panel. I'd like to thank President Bollinger and Vice President Chancellor Breslauer.